For today's session, we'll start, and each time we will start with Refuge. Feel free to join the Refuge uh, if you like, but don't feel obliged. You can also just listen. But if you'd like to join the Refuge, feel free to join your palms, and you can recite together with me. In the Buddha for refuge we go, wishing that all for their own sake on the greatest of paths forego, and the greatest of vows do take. In the Dharma for refuge we go, wishing all living beings might in knowledge of the sutras grow, gaining an ocean of insight. In the Sangha for refuge we go, wishing that all on earth and more in unhindered harmony grow, and lead us to the further shore. Okay, and then something that we recite in Jōdo Shinshū is Ryōgemon, and there's a few different variants of this. This is one that was translated by Reverend Inagaki Hisao. We'll recite this, and again, if you don't feel like you're or if you feel like you're not a follower of Jōdo Shinshū, please don't feel obliged to recite. But if you'd like, feel free to recite along with me. Ryōgemon. Having abandoned the mind of self-power to perform various practices and miscellaneous acts, I have entrusted myself to Amida Tathagata with singleness of heart, recognizing that he has resolved my crucial afterlife problem once and for all. I understand that at the moment such entrusting faith arises in me, my deliverance from samsara is settled with the assurance of birth in the Pure Land, and joyfully express that recitation of the Nembutsu which follows is to express my indebtedness to Amida. How grateful I am that I have come to this understanding through the benevolence of the founder Shinran Shōnin, who appeared in this country, and of the masters of the succeeding generations who have guided me with deep compassion. From now on, I will abide by the rules of conduct all my life. Okay, and then one other thing, which I'll explain a bit later, is a sutra opening verse. And we're not going to read sutras today. We'll start that next week, but we'll recite it because it's our tradition to recite it at the beginning anyway. The Dharma best, wonderful, and profound is really found through beginningless time. Now I can see it and hear its great sound and wish to know Buddha's meaning sublime. Okay, so for today, course overview, or I guess overview of the session. We'll do, or I guess it is an introduction. This is an overview for the whole course, actually. So today is the introduction. The plan is after today's session to go through the Three Pure Land Sutras, and I'll briefly explain what those are at the end of, towards the end of today's presentation. But there are three sutras that we take to be central in Jōdo Shinshū Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism: the larger sutra, or the Sutra of Immeasurable Life, the Amida Sutra, or sometimes called the Shorter Sutra, and the Contemplation Sutra. And then in Jōdo Shinshū, there are what have come to be called the seven Pure Land patriarchs. These are seven masters who have interpreted the Dharma in a way that's significant for our tradition. And then the person who we consider to be essentially the clarifier of the Jōdo Shinshū path is Shinran Shōnin. Technically, Shinran and many people within Jōdo Shinshū consider Honen Shōnin to be the founder and Shinran to be the clarifier. But Shinran has many works that we study more than Honen's works particularly. And so we will go through some of Shinran's works. And then Renyo, who is considered the restorer of the Jōdo Shinshū tradition, is someone whose works we would also like to study eventually. And we don't have to do this in any particular order. We might want to jump to Shinran's works after the Three Pure Land Sutras, or we can take a different order, however you like. So before we begin, I'll just say that this is meant to be a group which is fairly friendly to people who are new to Jōdo Shinshū and even to Buddhism, but there are some basic background assumptions that we might be working under. And so it assumes that you're familiar with what we could call the foundations of Śrāvakayāna and Mahāyāna Buddhism. So Śrāvakayāna Buddhism is what, from the Mahāyāna perspective, we would say are the foundations that all Buddhists hold in common. And today, many people would associate that primarily with Theravada Buddhism. But if you have a look within for example, the Chinese Buddhist canon, the Agamas are at the first couple volumes of the Taisho Tripitaka. And so they're also the foundation of East Asian Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. And then Mahayana Buddhism, the greater vehicle. These are the teachings about how to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. But if there are any questions or uncertainties as we go, we can explain them in a bit more detail. And I'll give a quick overview today. But if you'd like an overview of the basics, in a relatively easy to understand way, I could suggest Buddha Dharma, The Way to Enlightenment, this book on the right. It's quite a large book, but it's pretty affordable for the size. I think it's only, last time I checked, it was about $25. So I could recommend this. And this has summaries, or rather shortened versions or epitomized versions of many sutras. And it has some useful introductions. And so it gives you a kind of insider's introduction to Buddhism, rather than reading an academic, textbook. It's something that I'd consider a bit more friendly to practitioners. Okay, then what is this group about? So the idea is to read the texts of the Jōdo Shinshū tradition, which I mentioned earlier. We would consider it to be founded by Honen, but generally, publicly, most people would consider it to be the sect or the school founded by Shinran Shōnin, who lived in the 12th and 13th century. We will read, and when we do the readings of the sutras, we can take turns. So it won't be me droning on for the whole time. We can go around and read section by section if you're interested, but no pressure at all if you're not. And as I mentioned, the discussions will be posted publicly as a resource for future students of the Shin tradition, but your video won't be visible in the recordings. And if you wish to say something off the record, of course, you can ask me to stop the recording, and you may use your Dharma name or your personal name, however you wish. Today's session will be a general orientation, a review of the basics of Buddhism, Mahayana and Pure Land Buddhism, and preview of the road ahead. But we can also have a Q&A and open discussion at the end. I think there'll be some time. So first, we'll look at how we read sutras, how we're going to read sutras. Then the idea of deep time, or what kind of time frame are we talking about when we get into the Three Pure Land Sutras. The life of the Buddha, the Buddhist world, some basic cosmological assumptions, the Mahayana, Buddha lands. So Buddha lands, this is something we've already heard, the Pure Land. This is something that's central to what we're doing here. And then an overview of the Three Pure Land Sutras and a preview of the road ahead. So thus have I heard, the opening formula. Every sutra opens with thus have I heard. And this is a claim at the beginning of every sutra that it is a recollection of a speaker, usually Ananda, who reports what he heard on one occasion at a named place before a named assembly. So it gives the names of the people who join, the names of the monastics who are present. It reports where the Buddha was at what time and what he said. The formula performs three things at once. So it verifies that it's an eyewitness authority, that there's a fixed setting and a defined audience. So this is the framing of each sutra. And then before we read each sutra, I mentioned already, we recite the sutra opening verse. And this was actually composed by Empress Wu Zetian. So before reciting or studying the Dharma, it's customary in East Asia to recite the sutra opening verse, or kai-kyoge, as we call it in Japan. And Empress Wu composed this after reviewing Shikshananda's new translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra. So this is the versified translation that we already read. So in the Japanese pronunciation, it would go Mujo Jinjin Mi Myoho Hyakusen Mango Nanso Gu Gakon Ken Mon Tokushuji Gange Nyorai Shinjitsuki. So this is something which allows us to pay homage to the sutra before opening it, so that we recognize that we're not just reading like we would read a novel or we would read a magazine. It's a different kind of reading. It's a reading with intentionality and recognition that this is a sacred text. So it allows us to begin with some respect. Next, we'll have a look at the idea of deep time. And the basic measurement that we'll hear about throughout the larger sutra is the idea of a kalpa. So a kalpa is a deliberately incommensurable with lived time. And so there are many similes for what a kalpa is. A mountain worn away by a passing sleeve. So how long would it take to wear away a mountain by just passing a silk sleeve over it? Or mustard seeds removed one per century, the size of a mountain. And so this is designed to defeat imagination. Buddhas appear very rarely, and the tradition likens their appearance to the flowering of the udumbara. So udumbara is a flower which is said to blossom only so rarely that almost nobody has seen an udumbara flower. And the bodhisattva path to Buddhahood is measured in kalpas, not years. And most people, or most traditions, would say it takes 3 incalculable eons, or three incalculable kalpas. So we could say that patience is the medium the path is made of. If you don't have patience, you can't proceed on the bodhisattva path. This is usually how the bodhisattva path is framed. Dharmakara, who we'll talk about later, is what was a bodhisattva who became Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite life. And it said that he contemplated for 5 kalpas before he settled on his vows. And so we'll come back to this topic when we get to the larger sutra. And in terms of that long time, when we're thinking about long time, one of the basic assumptions of Mahayana Buddhism, actually all Buddhism, Śrāvakayāna Buddhism as well, is that a Buddha is not just one figure. So if it's news to you that there's this Amida Buddha, another Buddha, then the historical Buddha, Śākyamuni, or what we usually refer to as the historical Buddha Śākyamuni, well, from the Buddhist perspective, the insider perspective, a Buddha is not one figure. It's a type of being who has attained awakening. And so Śākyamuni Buddha, the Buddha of our world, who attained awakening 2,500 years ago, he was not the first Buddha, but was just one in a series. So in the remote past, Dipankara Buddha, appeared and taught. And then after him, a long succession of Buddhas, including Lokeshvara Raja Buddha, appeared. Each Buddha receives in an earlier life a prediction or vyakarana of his future Buddhahood. Śākyamuni received his prediction before Dipankara as Sumedha. And here's an image of a Sumedha when he was making the Bodhisattva vow resolution before Dipankara, who's standing. Usually Dipankara is depicted standing like this. And Dipankara was walking through this village that Sumedha lived in, and Sumedha wanted to offer something to the Buddha, but he was very poor. He didn't have anything to offer. But he saw that there was a puddle of mud before Dipankara, and so he lay his hair down, his long hair, over the puddle of mud, and allowed Dipankara to step over the mud without getting his feet dirty. And there are a few different versions or variants of this story, but as a result of that devotion, Sumedha was predicted that he will in the future become a Buddha called Śākyamuni Buddha. So the Buddha, also called the Bhagavan, which means blessed one, sometimes it's translated as blessed one, his own former lives, the Jataka material, or Jataka tales, are told as the accumulation that made this life possible. So a bodhisattva practices for these 3 kalpas or countless eons, accumulating wholesome qualities in order to attain Buddhahood. And this is the frame into which the larger sutra, the Sutra of Immeasurable Life, will insert a king called Dharmakara, who hears Lokeshvara Raja Buddha, and that king abdicated the throne and became the bodhisattva called Dharmakara. So we'll talk about that. We'll get into that next time when we start the larger sutra. So we're talking about spans of time which go beyond what contemporary historians would recognize. It's something beyond our imagining. The life of the Buddha. So talking about Śākyamuni Buddha, but as we'll see in the larger sutra, actually all bodhisattvas go through these life phases. So the birth. Shuddhodana of the Shakyas, the king or the chieftain of the Shakya clan was Shuddhodana, and his wife was Queen Maya. As a bodhisattva, after practicing for many, many kalpas, this bodhisattva who received his prediction before Dipankara, eventually, when his time to be born in the world came about, he descended from what's called Tushita heaven. He was a bodhisattva in Tushita called Shvetaketu. And Queen Maya saw this as a white elephant descending into her side. And then the bodhisattva was born in Lumbini Grove, took 7 steps, and declared that this would be his final birth. And here's an illustration of the bodhisattva after his birth. As many of you might know, there was a seer called Asita who predicted that this child would either become a universal monarch, or Chakravartin in Sanskrit, or a Buddha, an awakened one. But of course, he cried because he also knew that he would die before he would be able to see either. His mother, Queen Maya, died 7 days after the birth of the bodhisattva, and the child was raised by his aunt, Mahaprajapati. So what the birth narrative does for all bodhisattvas, they all have these kinds of supernormal births. What it does is it announces, or it lets the reader know in advance, that the life of this bodhisattva is going to be something supernormal. It's going to be something special. And that it's the manifestation, he's manifesting something that has been prepared for many, many kalpas, many, many eons. As he grew up in the palace, he eventually encountered the problem of suffering through the 4 gates, or some people call it the 4 sights. At the east gate, he saw a bent old man, and he learned that aging is not a misfortune befalling some people, but the condition of everyone, himself included. And so he realized the first sight, or he saw the first sight of old age. Everyone is going to get old. Everyone is going to also get sick. At the south gate, he saw someone with a body in pain. He realized that health is a temporary and undependable state, not a baseline. So we have to take action while we are still healthy, while we can still listen to the Dharma. A lot of people put it off until they're retired or they're older. But if you're able, as young as you can, you should study the Dharma. And then at the west gate, he saw a corpse being carried out and realized that the terminus, the end point, is not distant or avoidable. It's structural. We're all, by virtue of being born, going to eventually die. But then at the north gate, the optimistic aspect is that he saw a renunciant composed and in meditation. So this is not a problem, but an indication that there might be a response to the other 3, old age, sickness, and death. So the 4 gates are the tradition's compressed statement of the problem of that the entire Dharma answers. So nothing is wrong with the prince's life. He was living a very luxurious life, and the palace was exactly pleasant as advertised, but the insight that he came to was that pleasantness is not a solution. In fact, it can cause more problems if you don't come towards it, if you don't face it with right view. Now, he decided to go forth from home. He left his wife Yashodhara and the infant Rahula and his charioteer Chandaka and horse Kanpika at a river. And he studied under two teachers, two meditation teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputra. He achieved under them the highest meditative attainments available or known to these teachers at the time, but realized that they were insufficient. Just attaining a high meditative state is not sufficient. One must actually cut off suffering. One must attain bodhi. One must have wisdom. Wisdom is the key. How do you attain it? Well, at first he thought, as many people did, that austerity or ascetic practice was the path. So he practiced for 6 years at Uruvela with 5 companions. And actually, these 5 companions were sent by his father to spy on him, to make sure that he was safe. But they themselves became committed to asceticism. After he, as you can see in this picture, this is the way that his ending of austerities is depicted in East Asia is called leaving the mountain. Although it's not said in the sutras that he was in a mountain, it's the idea of someone practicing asceticism in East Asia is a sage in the mountain. So it's Śākyamuni leaving the mountain, ending austerities, and he decided, or he realized, that asceticism, austerities are not the path to liberation. It doesn't end suffering. It can bring more suffering. His 5 companions, who were themselves committed to asceticism, then left him in disgust. They saw he seemed to be committed for 6 years to asceticism, and now he's eating rice milk, which was more than they were used to eating. He was eating only a grain of rice a day, almost starving himself to death, only being kept alive by devas. And so the 5 companions left in disgust. So the tradition preserves this failure or display of failure from the Mahāyāna perspective deliberately. Extreme effort is shown to be tried, mastered, and found not to work. This is something that we also come back to a lot in Pure Land Buddhism. Extreme effort does not necessarily result in a breakthrough or liberation, depending on our circumstances. And then he went to the Bodhi tree. He sat under the Bodhi tree and resolved not to rise until he attained awakening. But Mara approached and tried to tempt him, tried to entice him to leave. He sent his daughters to tempt him and challenged the Bodhisattva's right to the Bodhi seat. But Śākyamuni called the earth to witness. The earth goddess, the earth Devi, recalled that he had accumulated merit over countless lives, and this defeated Mara. So Mara rules the realm of desire, and the sutras will describe Amida's land precisely as a place beyond Mara's reach. And how did he attain awakening? So he had a lot of realizations, Śākyamuni had a lot of realizations, which are said to be essential for a Buddha. One of them is recollection of his past lives. So he practiced meditation. He recalled his own past lives. He recalled other beings' past lives. And he realized directly the mechanism of rebirth rather than just believing it. He saw the arising and passing away of beings according to their deeds and understood the principle of karma. Karma is a Sanskrit word meaning action. We do deeds, these create our habitual tendencies, our karmic formations. This becomes our destiny in the future. We create our future through our own actions. We take that with us to the next life, and that process of cause and effect is called dependent origination. Everything arises through causes and conditions. Everything depends on other things. Who we are today depends on what we did in our previous existences. And who we will be in the future depends on what we do now. So each link, and I think many of you might be familiar with this, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Each link in the chain of dependent origination was understood by Śākyamuni when he attained awakening, and he also understood how the chain could be reversed. And through these realizations, he exhausted his defilements. And he realized that what he had done, what he had needed to do, he had done. He had achieved his duty. And verses of praise, which were recited by bodhisattvas in the Avatamsaka Sutra, mark the moment that his long search closed. And according to According to the Mahayana tradition, what happened then was bodhisattvas assembled, and the Buddha gave his first discourse, which is called the Avatamsaka Sutra. But from the Śrāvakayāna perspective, or the perspective of a human, it seems like the bodhisattva decided not to teach, and he said, the Dharma is too subtle and beings are too deep in craving to receive it. So it seemed like he expressed reluctance to teach the Dharma. And so Brahmadeva entreated him, there are some beings with just a little dust in their eyes. And then the Buddha surveyed the world as a pond of lotuses at different depths. Some beings are like lotuses deep in the mud, but some are ready to blossom. And he consented to teach the Dharma. And so he taught the wheel of Dharma. And the first beings that he taught were the 5 ascetics who abandoned him. And the first teaching was going to those who had given up on him. He taught the middle path. So the middle path is an essential teaching, the core of all Buddhist practice, the idea that neither through asceticism nor through indulgence can one progress spiritually. One has to practice the middle way. And he taught the Four Noble Truths. The first student to realize and understand the Four Noble Truths was Kaundinya. And so he's called Agyata Kaundinya, which means Kaundinya who understands, who realized. And that's the sort of what we call the Sangha. The Sangha is the Buddhist community. He then proceeded to convert or win over many other ascetics, many other lay people throughout what was the Gangetic Basin, or what is the Gangetic Basin in ancient Magadha, ancient Kosala, and these regions in India at the time, and southern Nepal. So Yasha and his friends, the 3 Kashyapas, 3 brothers, and 2 very prominent ascetics, disciples of Sanjaya, Shariputra, and Mount Galyayana. As he taught, the Buddha was given by lay donors, places like the Bamboo Grove and Jeta Grove. And these are significant locations where the Buddha taught throughout his career. These became the first monasteries, although they were not built up monasteries like monasteries of today. They were parks. And they are the settings in which most of the sutras are spoken. He also taught on Vulture Peak, which is a mountain near Rajagriha. He taught for about 45 years. The number of years differs from tradition to tradition, but I think most sects would lean towards 45 years. And he addressed his teaching to kings and beggars, Brahmins and outcasts, the learned and unlearned. So there's quite a lot of teachings that he gave during that period. But from the Mahayana Buddhist perspective, we would say that there's one teaching, one core essence, one awakening that the Buddha is trying to express, which is ultimately beyond discourse and expression. So the ultimate truth is beyond expression. And the Buddha teaches according to beings' capacities, and many different teachings fitted and adapted to the listener and the occasion. And so for this reason, there are hundreds and hundreds of sutras. And in the Taisho canon, the Chinese Buddhist canon, there's about 12,000 fascicles in total. So, I mean, some of those are commentaries, but there's quite a lot out there. One intention. So from the Mahayana perspective, as the Lotus Sutra claims, there was a single vehicle. The Buddha wanted to lead everyone to the one awakening, to the one truth. But he had lots of different teachings to adapt to different beings' needs. So this is like many rivers flowing into one ocean. There's one goal, but there are many different perspectives that everyone approaches from. And so all of you are maybe coming from different backgrounds, but the goal is for all of us to attain awakening and to become Buddhas so that we can then help enlighten others. And then the question becomes, well, what is that one teaching and how do you realize it? And so different schools have different explanations and different emphases. So some sects would say it's the Lotus Sutra teaching. Pure Land Buddhist schools would usually say it's the larger sutra, which contains the core teaching of the Buddha. So this is the traditional explanation of scriptural diversity. And it's worth noting how different it is from a developmental one. So from a historical perspective, it's just a mess. But if you look at it from an insider Buddhist perspective, everything makes sense, actually. We have a way of explaining why there's a diversity of traditions, diversity of teachings. So it's about pedagogical precision. So why are there so many sutras? Because there's so many different beings who need different kinds of teaching. So you can't teach everyone with the same message. It's just going to go over some people's head. You can't teach everyone perfection of wisdom because most people aren't going to understand that. So you have to start where people are. So that's why the Buddha has different levels of teaching depending on who he is addressing. So it's like a teacher never giving the same medicine twice. Next, we'll have a look at the Buddhist world. And first, for that, we'll have a look at the law of karma. And so most people look at karma and dependent origination using what's called the Bhava Chakra or Wheel of Life, which is a Himalayan artistic representation. But I found an equivalent from Japan, which is a diagram of the 10 realms and 6 minds emanating from mind. So from the Mahāyāna perspective, everything emerges from our minds. And here's the character Shin, which means mind, right at the center. And everything in the world is emerging from that, whether it's blissful or painful. And what we do, and that relates to karma, what we do creates our characters, creates the world that we live in, but only if it's intentional. So the mind is the driver. And so this is also in the first verse of the Dhammapada, that the mind goes before all things. It precedes all things. Just like the footprint of the ox leads the wheel of a cart. So it's the intentional action of our body, speech, and mind, and the disposition it leaves behind, the habitual habit energies that it leaves behind. So the results that come about as a result of our karma are not assigned by a judge. There's a popular image of King Yama, assigning people to different destinies, but actually the one who creates our destinies, our future lives, is ourselves. We create it through our intentional actions. And our results follow as consequences of our actions. So this is what this is a certainty. So the effects of our karma need not ripen in this life, and the account is carried across births. And we go alone. The world, in this world, we are born alone and die alone, and no one can undergo another's experience in their place. So we are accountable for our own karma. We are responsible for our own deeds. And karma leads us through 6 destinies. There are different ways of splitting this up, but basically there are 3 unpleasant ones, which are called 3 evil destinies. Dharmakara's very first vow, when we get to the Pure Land Sutras, as we'll see, is that in his land, the 3 lower destinies of animals, hungry ghosts, and hell must not exist. His second vow is that no one born in his land, in the Pure Land, falls back into the lower realms. So the Pure Land is defined before anything else negatively by what it excludes. The pleasant destinies are those of the gods or devas, humans, and asuras. So this might be familiar to some of you. The lower realms are the animal realm, the hungry ghost realm, and the hell realm. Basically, as a summary of this worldview, we're trying to attain awakening. What's the fastest way to attain awakening? That's why we aim for birth in the Pure Land. But before then, the Buddha encourages beings, if they're not ready to hear about the Pure Land Dharma, he encourages beings to be born as humans, because it's in the human realm that it's easiest for us to hear and study the Dharma. So although the Deva realm sounds blissful, you might be blissed out of your mind and not be able to study the Dharma there. And if you like heavy metal, hell might sound really cool, but I don't think you want to be born there. So really the human realm is where you want to be born. So what is this world? It's not a very pleasant world. And the sutras call it various things. So saha means endurance. In the Japanese pronunciation is shaba, the shaba world. And so the name is a diagnosis of our world. This is what we have to put up with, this world. It's also called the defiled world, or Edo. This is in contrast to Jōdo, the Pure Land, and the pair is a comparison of environments, not moral worth. So ultimately, both of them are, everything is contained within the embrace of the Buddha. Everything is contained within the realm of nirvana, but we can't realize it. And so it's much easier for us to realize realize the truth in a pure land than a defiled world. But both of them are ultimately non-dual. But that doesn't help an ordinary being who is not likely to realize non-duality here and now. And then the five degenerations. Our world is one of these five degenerations. We'll see this in the Pure Land Sutras. That's to say, degenerating kalpa. The eon, the age, is becoming more and more degenerate. Views are degenerating passions, degenerating beings, and shortened lifespans. So a lot of things are getting worse. Okay, now you might say, well, modern medicine is making our lifespans longer, but you could say this is a spiritual degeneration. We may be living longer, but we're wasting more share of our lives, especially because of distractions like smartphones. So the five degenerations cause a formal chain. So we can have a look at this. Actually, the order of the five degenerations is actually number 3, the passions. So greed, anger, ignorance. These produce beings of diminished capacity. So our capacity for receiving the Dharma, understanding it, decreases because of our increase in passions. And then our views are distorted. And this makes the age what it is. It makes it a degenerate kalpa, a degenerate age, and our lives grow shorter within it, our spiritual lives, you could say. So this is a sutra account of why a teaching fitted to beings of weak capacity, like us, frankly, is required. Now, dependent origination is basically the idea. In short, it's expressed as this arising, that arises, this ceasing, that ceases. So everything depends on something else. And the corollary in the Pure Land tradition is that since ignorance is the first link, and ignorance is precisely what a deluded being cannot see past unaided, the exit cannot be found by looking harder from inside. So we need some help in this regard. But the 12 links might be familiar with you. Here's an interesting illustration, starting from name and form. But basically, this is a chain from ignorance, formations, consciousness, name and form, the six senses, contact, feeling, craving, grasping, becoming, birth, aging, and death, which explains how we experience the suffering that we do. So this is something that I think might be familiar to you, but we can go into it in more detail later if you're interested. But basically, if you read it in that forward direction, starting from ignorance, that's how suffering assembles. But you can also read it. You can read it opposite. Well, you can read how it dissembles. So if you remove ignorance, then karmic formations will cease, and so forth. You can also there are also sutras which read it backwards, as an ending chain. So one of the other important things of this teaching is that nothing in the chain of dependent origination is a self. So the links condition one another without anyone standing behind them. So this is a core teaching of all Buddhist schools, that there's no self. So this is called anatman. There's no self, no soul. And that's because the chain is because the chain is conditioned, it is in principle breakable, which is the whole basis of hope in Buddhism. So because everything arises due to conditions, if you end the condition, if you cause one of them to cease, then the next link in the chain ceases. And the Four Noble Truths, something which might also be familiar to you, but this is what the Buddha taught to his first 5 disciples. And you could think of this as a physician's format. So dukkha is the diagnosis, suffering, the unsatisfactoriness of everything conditioned. the cause, identifying the cause. That's craving, and behind it are the three poisons: greed, anger, and ignorance. The prognosis is that because there is a cause, again, going back to dependent conditioning, because there is a cause, it can be cured. If there's a cause that can end, if you can end ignorance, if that's possible, then that means ultimately suffering of samsara can be ended. And then the path, the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. So the conventional Buddhist path is to practice wholesome deeds, practice the Noble Eightfold Path, practice wholesome deeds, attain right view, and practice meditation to cause the three poisons to end. Amida's light is in the Pure Land Sutras is described as dissolving the three poisons, and the larger sutra says of Dharmakara that through countless kalpas he never once gave rise to thoughts of greed, anger, or harm. When Shinran describes himself, he uses the same three terms, greed, anger, and ignorance, and claims no exception from any of them. So the Pure Land perspective is one of which I think some people might view as somewhat dualistic, but basically it's also being realistic. We are beings of greed, anger, and ignorance, and we shouldn't pretend to be holy beings if we're not. We should recognize, on the other hand, the Buddha is someone who doesn't have greed, anger, and ignorance. Now, this is something which is also important to all kinds of Buddhism, and that's faith. Now, faith in Jōdo Shinshū Buddhism is a very, very it's actually a very different kind of faith than we're talking about in other schools of Buddhism and that we're talking about in Western religions. But recently I've been reading this book by Andy Rodman, Thus Have I Seen, Visualizing Faith in Early Indian Buddhism. And he explains how early Indian Buddhism, particularly in the Avadanas, conceives of faith according to three kinds. So the first kind of faith that's referred to in early Buddhist texts is what in Sanskrit is called Shraddha. So Shraddha is a kind of clarity, and so some people might call it like clarity of mind. You feel clear about something. This is kind of more of a cognitive, verificational variety of faith. It's something that we might not even call faith in English. So faith is not necessarily the best word for all of these. This is said to or believed to arise from seeing something confirmed to be as it was said to be. So it's verificational. You hear the Buddha say, give a teaching, and then you practice, let's say you practice meditation, you realize what he said to be true. Let's say you go through the four jhanas, you see, oh, we have the jhana factors. This seems to actually correspond to what we see in the sutras. And then you gain faith in the Buddha's words. The objects are only nominally persons. So, for example, one can have shraddha, one can have this kind of faith in a trustful speaker, like the Buddha, but it is through them that you have faith in impersonal objects like karma and merit transfer. So what does it mean to have shraddha in the Buddha? It doesn't mean devotion. There is a kind of devotion that I'll talk about in a moment, but it's actually to have shraddha in the Buddha is to have shraddha, to have this kind of verificational faith in the Buddha's teachings, that you have trust. It's maybe more like trust. You trust that what the Buddha says is true. So that's shraddha. So this is more intellectual than emotional. So it's not really devotion. It's more, it can be kind of logical, kind of cognitive. It's more trust in a proposition than devotion to a being, but it can allow for admission of non-knowledge. So this is something that Bhikkhu Bodhi makes a good point of in his in the Buddha's words, that shraddha is actually also admitting, I don't know for sure whether it's true or not, but because I have shraddha, because I have trust that what the Buddha said is probably true, I'm going to test it out and see if it's true. So this is basically why, for example, why does someone sit down to meditate? If you sit down to meditate, you have to have some kind of trust that this is going to get you somewhere. Otherwise, you watch TV or do something else, right? You're not going to spend 45 minutes just sitting doing what you might think is nothing. you have some faith, some trust that this is going to do something. So that's what Shraddha helps with. So in other words, it gives you motivation to act. So it's admitting, I don't know for sure, I haven't realized it for sure, but I have the motivation because I have Shraddha, I have the motivation that I'm going to try and see if this works and if there's truth behind this. Prasada is what we would call an affective or visceral variety. This is more of a feeling. This is a feeling. And it's something that arises spontaneously without consent or even awareness on seeing what's called a prasadika object or person. So for example, you see a beautiful Buddha image, you see a beautiful stupa, or you see a great disciple of the Buddha like Mahakāshyapa, and you give right, and then this faith rises up, it wells up effectively, it's visceral. And this gives rise to the feeling that you may have to make an offering to this wonderful being. So I'll give you an example. When I first, when I first, I mean, I still feel faith when I see it, the relics of a Buddha, but the first time that I was told that, oh, these little crystals are the Buddha's relics that were gathered after he was cremated, it gave rise to such prasada in me that I fell to my knees and prostrated. It felt like completely involuntary. So this is something that I think a lot of people might have experience with. This is probably this seems like it's you see something, you give rise to the prasada, and then you end up giving a donation or giving flowers or giving food as an offering because you want to give back. So it kind of implies a feeling of gratitude, which is something which becomes important in Jōdo Shinshū. Now, in the Avadanas, the past life stories of the Buddha and disciples, usually beings get a prophecy after they do this. So then the Buddha prophesies, in the future, you will, as a result of this act of giving out of prasada, you will become a Buddha of such and such a name in the future. So it's an external karmic intrusion breaking the inertia of one's own karma. So that's to say, this is something which is kind of implied that what's happening is there's a power, there's something within an object, like a beautiful image of the Buddha or a bodhisattva, that has its own karma that's intruding into your own mind stream and giving rise to faith. So this implies that there is the possibility for Buddhas to actually have an effect upon us. The third one is bhakti, and in these stories, like the Divyavadana, it's usually described in a kind of negative way or an ineffective way. This is a personal and emotional devotion directed at a deity or human as an agent expected to intervene. So this is a thing, it's instrumental, right? And consistently depicted as ineffectual. So, I mean, this is like the Buddha, you could say it from the Buddhist perspective, it's depicted kind of satirically, right? Or it's kind of like a straw man presentation, but it's essentially devotion, which is, it has an instrumental intention. You're devoted, but you want to get something out of the god, or you want to get something out of the Buddha. So, for example, Ashoka made a final gift, a mango, out of bhakti rather than prasada, and apparently it went unrewarded. So there are lots of interesting examples like this, but yeah, this is what Rotman suggests. In Jōdo Shinshū, faith actually has some quality, what we call faith or Shinjin, which means the first character, which we'll talk about in a future session. The first character, Shin, means it's usually translated as faith, but it actually it could imply any one of these three, depending on the context. And the second character is Shin, which means mind. So faith, mind. It actually is something given by the Buddha, right? So that kind of faith is something which we can't give rise to ourselves. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future, but it ends up having some characteristics of Shraddha and Prasada, but it definitely is not instrumental. And yeah, and Muhammad mentions that bhakti is considered positive in some forms of Hinduism. And there are also Buddhist texts that would call bhakti positive as well. There are some later Buddhist texts that use the term in a positive way. So going on, another important thing which is common to all Buddhist sects is the idea of merit. kudoku in Japanese, or punya in Sanskrit. So what is merit? It's also karmic. So it's something as a result of wholesome action. It's real. It can be quantified in principle and then transferred to others. So the idea is that someone who does a practice, they practice the Dharma, you can then transfer the wholesome karma from that practice to other beings. And this is usually done at the end of a practice. And we will recite a kind of dedication of merit at the end of this session. But this is called ekko in Japanese. And so this is merit directed away from oneself towards other beings or towards awakening rather than towards a pleasant rebirth. So karma, positive karma left undirected can result in a wholesome rebirth in a higher realm. But if you direct the merit towards awakening, you can prevent yourself from being born as a deva and continue as a human, or direct the merit to being born in the Pure Land. In the Pure Land Sutras, beings hear Amida Buddha's name, rejoice in hearing it, and then turn their merit towards birth in his land. So the direction of travel is from us, dedicate the merit away from yourself upwards to the Pure Land. But for Shinran, the direction reverses. What's transferred rather is Amida's merit to us, and ekko becomes something received, not performed. So this is something related to faith as well. So Amida is a Buddha who attained awakening after practicing as Dharmakara Bodhisattva. Dharmakara Bodhisattva accumulated so much wholesome karma, an indescribable amount, that his merit can be transferred to all beings. We can receive his transfer of merit. It's important to understand that no one can undergo another's suffering due to karma in their place, but merit, unlike karmic retribution, can be given. So you can't you can't dedicate your negative karma to other beings, but you can dedicate wholesome merit to others. That would have very bad consequences, I think, if you could dedicate your negative karma. Now we'll have a look at the Mahāyāna. So how do we build up that foundation? So the three or one vehicles. So Mahāyāna Buddhism is conceived of as the third of three vehicles. We call it the Bodhisattvayana, the path to Buddhahood by practicing the Bodhisattva path. But we talk about three vehicles in Mahāyāna Buddhism. The first one is the Śrāvaka vehicle. Śrāvaka means hearer. So this is the vehicle of the path for those who want to attain arhatship, awakening, on the basis of the teaching received. And it's complete on its own terms. It's a complete path to awakening. You don't need the Mahāyāna to become an arhat. A pratyeka Buddha is someone who attains awakening outside of a Dharma age. So when the Buddha's teaching is not in the world, if you attain awakening, it's because you practice the Dharma in the wilderness by yourself, you realize dependent origination, and then you become what's called a pratyeka Buddha. But a bodhisattva is someone who doesn't postpone awakening. This is a common misunderstanding, but aims at nothing less than full Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. So the bodhisattva path is initiated by what's called bodhicitta, the resolve for awakening. That's to say, I vow to attain awakening as a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. But the Lotus Sutra suggests that there's one vehicle, or ichijo. So the Lotus Sutra says that the first two vehicles, Śrāvakayāna and Pratyeka Buddhayana, the path of the Śrāvakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, were provisional. And there was only ever one destination, the Buddha vehicle, taught in stages and fitted to capacity. So it's not that there's one separate vehicle from the Bodhisattvayana or the others, that they're actually all one vehicle. They all converge. So again, this is like all of the rivers. Let's say there are three major rivers. They all converge on one ocean. So there's one ocean that all beings are destined to attain. So it's not meant as a polemic. Some people take this as polemical, but it's actually about pedagogy. So a good teacher gives a partial goal to someone to motivate them if they could not attain the full goal. So every teaching must be assessed for whom it is fitted to, and no teaching can be read as simply final. So as an example, this gives rise to the idea of skillful means, or hoben, upaya kaushalya in Sanskrit, the idea that a teaching may be provisional without being false, fitted to a hearer's present capacity and superseded later. The most famous example is the teaching of the burning house. There are children absorbed in play, and they won't heed an abstract warning, fire, fire, but they will heed the promise of a fun ride in a cart. So these children in a house, they're promised a ride in a cart, and they come out. The point is, and then they come out of the house, and the carts that they were promised were actually they ended up not having two of them. They ended up not having a cart pulled by I think it was one was a deer. There was a deer, maybe a horse, and an ox. But ultimately, they all got an ox cart. So the father saved them, although they ended up not having a deer cart, for example. The point is that the teaching saved the children. The point is not whether what the Buddha said or what the father said was true or false. So this is a teaching that some of you will already be familiar with. So sorry if I'm repeating information that you already know, but the Pure Land in Mahāyāna Buddhism is itself repeatedly described in those terms. So the birds that we'll encounter when we read the sutras, the birds that are said to sing the Dharma there are said to be produced by the Buddha as skillful means. So they're actually produced. They're something that someone can actually hear, but that's not the ultimate truth, right? So we're not trying to go to a paradise. We're trying to realize the ultimate truth that it indicates. So nowhere is it suggested that skillful means are false. So not everything perceived is the ultimate truth, but insofar as the teaching guides one to liberation, it is true. So Śrāvakayāna is true. The teaching of attaining nirvana through practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, that's a true teaching. You can attain liberation by practicing that, but you can keep going further to attain Buddhahood. So that's what the Mahāyāna does. Buddha nature is another important teaching in Mahāyāna Buddhism, most famously emphasized by the Nirvana Sutra, that all beings possess this Buddha nature, the capacity for awakening, that all beings had. So it's not unevenly distributed. So this is like gold. Gold in ore is already gold, and refining it does not create its purity, it only reveals it. So this cuts against despair, so no one is constitutionally excluded. Everyone is assured of awakening. Though if our capacity for awakening is universal, why does almost nobody realize awakening? So Pure Land thought lives in that gap, and it maintains full confidence in the capacity and full realism about the conditions. We understand that we are benighted beings with greed, anger, and ignorance, but we have the confidence that we can attain awakening because we have Buddha nature. What is the one truth that the Buddha's teachings are leading us to? It is a truth beyond words, and this is expressed as emptiness and suchness. So emptiness is not nothingness. It's rather the teaching that nothing possesses an independent nature of its own, which is precisely why anything can arise, change, and be liberated. The Bodhisattva gives while knowing giver, gift, and recipient are all empty. Suchness, shinyo or hosho, is tatata and dharmata. Thusness, tatata, suchness, and dharmata, dharma nature. This is the nature of things as they are seen without the imposition of preference and category. So it's not a substance, it's not a thing that we grasp or gain. Its appearance is seen rightly. It's the nature of things when we have wisdom. When we have wisdom, we can see the nature of things as suchness or dharma nature. So why do we give it a name? Well, what's formless cannot be addressed, aspired to, or called upon. So if we just say, well, we can't describe it, well, then what are we aiming for? So we do have these descriptions, but these are provisional descriptions. The tradition holds that suchness, in like manner, takes form and takes a name. So the form that suchness can take is something like the Pure Land or the Buddha's forms, the various Buddha bodies. And so one of them is one of the forms that suchness can take compassionately to help us is the Pure Land. So, the sutras, when they describe the Pure Land, they describe a land with directions. So it seems to have directions. It seems to have distances. It describes things being a certain height. It has a kind of furniture. It has pavilions. It has trees. It has nets, bells, canopies. In the same breath, it says that all phenomena are like dreams, phantoms, and echoes. Neither statement cancels the other, and every Pure Land thinker you will read is working out the relation between suchness and the manifestation of suchness out of compassionate means. And then finally, the final aspect of the Mahāyāna that I'll mention is the idea of the three Dharma ages. This is essential for understanding a lot of why should we practice Pure Land Buddhism rather than just Mahāyāna Buddhism or Śrāvakayāna? Well, there is this idea that the Dharma degenerates over time. So there's firstly the true Dharma age, Shoho or Shobo, that teaching, practice, and attainment are all present and possible. The path works as described. So if you're within the first 500 years of the Dharma after Śākyamuni Buddha taught and passed away, then you can continue practicing and attaining the teachings exactly as taught in all of the sutras. You can get all of the effects. If you uphold the precepts, if you practice the Noble Eightfold Path, you will have the effects promised in them. And that's why we have so many great beings from that period. We have Ananda, Mahakāshyapa, Mahakaundinya. We have, of course, Ashvaghosha, and towards the tail end, Nagarjuna, right? But then the teaching and practice remain. So we still have the sutras. You could still practice them, but attainment becomes rarer. And this is called the semblance dharma, Zoho. So it's like a reflection of the true dharma. And this lasts for, depending on the tradition, it either lasts for 500 years or 1,000 years. In either case, by the time of Shinran Shōnin, Honen was born in 1132. So yeah, but it depends on when we start counting the true Dharma age. I guess it should actually start a little bit earlier, but when the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma. But yeah, that's a great point. So if the Buddha passed away in 369, according to the short chronology, then Honen was born 1,500 years after the Buddha passed away, and then all of the Kamakura schools of Buddhism in Japan begin in the age of the latter Dharma, or Mappo. So Matsu means end. And here the teaching survives. We still have the sutras. We still have many sutras, but if you practice them, you won't attain the results. And one of the reasons why is because we are so far away from the Buddha. And also our capacity starts to decline. And we're born in this place, in this age, also because we may not have the karmic seeds to be born in the age of born and practiced in the age of true Dharma. So the period after the age of the latter Dharma, without Dharma circulating in the world, when only Pratyeka Buddhas may attain their provisional awakening, will be immense, until Maitreya attains Buddhahood and turns the wheel of Dharma again. You can have a look at various calculations. I mean, some people would say it's millions of years. It's a long time. So really, I mean, there are some people who want to wait until Maitreya attains Buddhahood, but from the Pure Land perspective, I mean, Maitreya will establish a Pure Land, but really we should be aiming for birth in a Pure Land that's available here and now. So Amitabha's Pure Land is available here in the age of latter Dharma. If we practice in this world, we're not likely to get results. So we should aim to be born in another land where the true Dharma is always present. That's the Pure Land. So this is a claim about the fit between a teaching and its moment. In the idiom of skillful means, a dispensation depends on the practitioner's capacity. One must receive the appropriate teaching for the actual conditions, and Honen and Shinran build directly on this and Daocho before them. So that brings us to Buddha lands. So what are Buddha lands? This is the key to what we're going to be doing in the next few weeks. This is Pure Lands. The term that we find in Sanskrit is Buddha Kshetra, which means Buddha field or Buddha land. And in East Asian Buddhism, it's usually referred to as Jōdo, Pure Land. So Buddha lands are, it's basically the idea that there are innumerable world systems, each with its own Buddha teaching in it. And the sutras count them as many as the sands of the Ganges, or many, many more than that even. Each Buddha presides over a Buddha field or Buddha kshetra shaped by the vows that produced it. So when those Buddhas who are in those lands were practicing the Bodhisattva path, they make aspirations, they make vows. And when those vows are fulfilled, they give rise to those Buddha fields of certain qualities. So some of those fields are pure, some like ours are defiled. So our world is considered a Buddha land, but it's not a pure land. There are some people who claim it's a pure land, but you can have a look around and see for yourself what you think. So the Amida Sutra calls this world the murky world of perverted views, rampant passions, and short lives. And again, you can have a look around and see if that's accurate or not. So the fundamental Mahayana geography is not one with a heaven above, but a plurality of worlds in all directions of different quality. All of them are reachable in principle, but you have to choose one if you're planning to go to another one. And Dharmakara, the macron should be over the other A. Dharmakara has shown 21 billion of these before designing his own. So we'll have a look at that in the larger sutra. Dharmakara Bodhisattva sees countless Buddhas in many, many worlds in crafting his own vows and creating his own Buddha land, and tries to determine what's the best way to create, what's the best kind of land to create. So he attained awakening after practicing to fulfill his vows. And he goes by two names in Sanskrit, Amitayas and Amitabha. Amitayas translates to Muryo-ju, which means immeasurable life, and Amitabha translates to Muryo-ko, immeasurable light. So these two names come from Dharmakara's vows themselves, and in short, they are pronounced Amida or Amita. So that's why in Japanese Buddhism, it's pronounced Amida. Amita is the classical Sanskrit pronunciation. In Prakrits, like in Central Asian languages, where some of these sutras were translated from, the ta is pronounced da. So Amida is a genuine non-East Asian rendering of his name. So the Amida Sutra, the shorter Pure Land Sutra, which we'll read in the future, explains the pair directly, the lifespan of that Buddha and those in his land, and of those in his land is beyond measure. So Amitayas, and his light shines over all Buddha lands without hindrance. So Amitabha. The larger sutra then multiplies the light names: boundless light, unhindered light, incomparable light, flame king, pure, joyous, wisdom, incessant, inconceivable, inexpressible, and light surpassing the sun and moon. What the light is not what the light is not merely praised. Those it touches are freed from greed, anger, and ignorance. Body and mind become gentle. And then the contemplation also adds the phrase, the light reaches those who are mindful of the Buddha and takes them in without ever forsaking them. So I think we see in some translations of Shinran when he quotes this, embraced and never forsaken. There are various ways that this has been translated. So what we'll have a look at in the next section or next session is the first of the Three Pure Land Sutras, which is the larger sutra. As a quick preview, this sutra is set on Vulture Peak near Rajagriha. Starts when Ananda observes that the Buddha's countenance, his face, is unusually radiant and asks why. So why? So this is the key that Shinran picks up on as to indicating that this was the definitive intent of Śākyamuni Buddha appearing in the world. So Śākyamuni Buddha's answer is that the reason the Buddha appears in the world at all is to spread the Dharma and to bring true benefit to beings. And this question is that reason. So he's the answer to this question is that reason. So he's expressing this he has this radiance in his countenance because he wants to bring benefit to beings. And then he gives a discourse on a narrative deep in the past, many, many kalpas ago. Dipankara, he talks about Dipankara, who I mentioned earlier, the succession of Buddhas, and comes to Lokeshvara Raja Buddha and the king who becomes Dharmakara, who made 48 vows. fulfilled them. And then because he fulfilled them, he gave rise to a land. The land is described. And 3 grades of aspirants who were born there are also described. Then in the second fascicle, which we'll get to eventually, there's a long unflinching passage or couple of sections on ordinary human life, anxiety about property, isolation and death, and disbelief in causality. So people who disbelieve in causality. So there's lots of reasons why these things are in the sutra, and we'll talk about that. On the right, you see the mandala of the larger sutra, which is the one presented on the website of Hisawi Nagaki sensei, who was the founder of the Horai Association. So we'll go through this when we read the sutra. And so from the Jōdo Shinshū perspective, in the sutra, Shinran treats the sutra as the true and definitive teaching, and everything else in the tradition is read through this teaching. So the larger sutra is the key to understanding all of Jōdo Shinshū. It's the key to understanding all of Mahāyāna Buddhism. It's the key to understanding our whole lives. Everything in the world can be understood through the sutra, but many of the things that we come to understand through it are implicit. So there's this idea of onmitsu, or a kind of hidden teaching that's implicit, and we have to tease that out. Next, what we'll read after that is the Contemplation Sutra. I will skip introducing it or summarizing it here because we'll get to that eventually. But you can have a look at this slide if you like on the recording, if you like later. But this is Shinran does not consider this sutra to be the definitive teaching, but it's something pointing to the definitive teaching. So it contains the definitive teaching as a kernel or as an implication. And then the Amida Sutra. This is something that this is the shorter sutra. It's one that many people may recite, sometimes on a daily basis. It's quite short, and we'll read it as well. Shinran also doesn't consider this to be the definitive teaching, but he calls it the true gate. It's the true teaching, and it also leads to the definitive teaching of the larger sutra. So it's also very essential. There's some terminology that I have here, but I think maybe it's better that we get into that when we encounter it. So there's no point in reading a glossary to you. Okay, road ahead. That's the last thing that I want to cover today. The structure of this reading group. So we'll read through the works of the Jōdo Shinshū Pure Land tradition together, and each session will be 90 minutes. And I'll provide the readings each time together with supplementary notes from the Shin tradition where necessary. And we can take turns reading. As stated before, your videos will not be recorded, only the audio, and you may use your Dharma names if you wish. There's no attendance obligations, and there's also no required readings, so come as you are. If you miss a session, please catch up with the recording. You don't have any obligation to join for every session. And then in the next slides, I'll go through the text that we will. I hope we'll eventually cover everything, but it's quite a lot. It'll be divided by the volumes of the Jōdo Shinshū Seiten. Seiten means canon, so the holy texts. We do not need to read these in order, but we'll start with the Three Pure Land Sutras. So we have the 3 sutras there. There are some alternative versions in the Jōdo Shinshū canon. There's also there's a Sanskrit also for the Infinite Life and Amida Sutra, and we can have a look at those too if you're interested. So those are the 3 Pure Land Sutras. And then what comes after in the Shin canon is the tradition of the patriarchs. So the Indian patriarchs are Nagarjuna, and he has 2 texts in the canon. Vasubandhu, or Tenjin Bosatsu. He has that one, the Jōdo one in the canon. And then the Chinese patriarchs, Tanduan, who has those 3 texts, Dao Chō, who I mentioned earlier, the Anrakushu, which was translated by the the Shandao tradition recently, and then Shandao himself, the commentary on the Contemplation Sutra, Kangyo-sho, the Dharma service liturgy, Hoji-san, method of contemplation, Canon Bomon, liturgy of praise for birth, and hymns on the Pratyutpana. So Shandao is considered probably the most important patriarch of the Chinese ones in both Jōdo Shu and Jōdo Shinshū. And then Japanese patriarchs, Shinran considered Genshin, who's a Tendai master, to be one of the patriarchs of Japanese Pure Land. So he has he has these texts in the Jōdo Shinshū Canon. Then Honen, in Jōdo Shinshū we call him Genku, and he has quite a few texts. So as I mentioned, essentially Honen is considered the founder, or Shinran considered him the founder of his Dharma gate. And then Shinran's works. Basically, most of them are in the collected works of Shinran. So we can go through that. Then there are some wasans, not included in the 3 collections translated in the collected works, which we can read as well. And then there's another text called Compass to the West, which was recently translated by Arai Sensei as, sorry, I have it here. Yeah, I forgot the name. I think he gives it another name. Yeah, I have it on my shelf over there, but can't see it from here. Then there's another, you could say extra canonical work, but it is included in the canon, the record of Shinran's dreams, plus letters of Eshini and dialogues of the life to come, which is something I haven't read that one. Might be interesting. And then there's the early tradition after Shinran. So the works of Kakunyo, most of which haven't been translated, in Josen and Zonkaku. So for Zonkaku, I'm part of a project called the Zonkaku Project, where we're translating the works of Zonkaku. He's a very interesting figure. Then Jukaku, who wrote the biography of Kakunyo, and then the works of Renyo. So we already read the Ryōgemon, confessional statement. So we already read one of these. And then there are some other patriarchs who have letters of their own. But basically, we don't have to read these in any particular order. I would suggest maybe after the Three Pure Land Sutras, maybe we could read something by Shinran. Kyōgyo Shinsho is very long, but we could read some wasans, but we'll just see what you're interested in doing. There are some other works as well. The Tanisho, this is a lot of people's introduction to Jōdo Shinshū. This is attributed to one of Shinran's companions called Yui Enbo. The Anjin Ketsu Josho is also very interesting. I translated that a couple of years ago. And then there's some other works as well. So we'll have a dedication of merits, but before then, let me just stop sharing so we can see each other. And yeah, I'd just like to ask if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to bring up about what we went through or what we're going to do going forward.
Yeah, I have a very quick question.
Yeah.
I saw when you were going through the Saiten, I think one of the Chinese masters, like one of their works, it said it wasn't cited by Shinran at any point. So why is it part of the Saiten?
Yeah, there are some works that are not quoted by Shinran.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just see quickly. Let's see. All right, so short treatise on the meaning of the Pure Land, Lakulon an Lakujodo gi. So yeah, something like this. This is something which is written by Tanluan on Pure Land, Buddhism, which Shinran might never quote. It's still important to know what Tanluan was writing and what he thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably one of the main reasons it's included. Another reason could be that it's relied upon by later teachers, Zonkaku, Kakunyo, uh, Renyo. It could be relied on by Honen, but for each particular one, there might be a particular reason why it's included. But not everything is included because it's directly quoted by Shinran.
I see. All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, Muichi, do you have any comments?
Uh, no, I don't. I don't. I'm excited. Uh, so we're gonna read through the three sutras, and then we're gonna read through just three of, or are we gonna look at different versions,
So what
or
we'll
as we
do,
go, maybe like as we go, we could like, oh, like this is a little different here and stuff like
yeah,
that.
what we'll do just to keep it focused, we'll read one. I mean, I have a translation of them, so we'll read that as the focus, and then if you have other copies, like I have a few other ones here. You can keep those open and follow along, sentence by sentence. And if you'd like to add a comment that, oh, this is translated in a different way, that's interesting, then yeah, we can get into that. Um, what I've done so far for the first one is I've interspersed comments by Shinran on the larger sutra, where he mentions part of the larger sutra to help us understand where does this fit within Jōdo Shinshū. But most of it we can just read directly, and then if you find any parallels, interesting parallels in other versions, we can discuss that. We can discuss the
Yeah,
Sanskrit as well.
I I was particularly interested in how in the Sanskrit of the longer sutra, the uh the original vow is has some differences, so that would definitely be
Yeah,
an interesting.
yeah, we can look into that too. Um, and uh, and then for the Contemplation Sutra, the way I've set it up is essentially that we'll read through it with Shantao's commentary. I mean, that's essentially how it's read in Jōdo Shinshū, or how it's understood in Jōdo Shinshū, is through Shandao's lens. So this is something which, if we're thinking from an academic perspective, it's maybe, it may not be, uh, the most, it's not an objective way of going about it, but from the Jōdo Shinshū perspective, we read these texts through the lens of Shinran. Right. So what does this mean for Shinran? And that's essentially how we read it in Jōdo Shinshū. So that's something that we'll get into each time. Clearer asked, "Hi there, I have a question for Shingan. You introduced three types of faith. What type of faith would you say Shinjin in Shinshū is? Is it none of those or all of those?" Ultimately, it's none of them. We'll get into that in more detail, but ultimately, maybe to make it not only brief but also, I guess, profound, would be Shinjin is Buddha nature, and Shinjin is also bodhicitta. So Buddha nature is our underlying ability to attain awakening, and bodhicitta is our aspiration to attain awakening. And there are two kinds of bodhicitta. One of them is relative bodhicitta. That's when we make a resolution, a vow to attain awakening. And ultimate bodhicitta is actually um, our underlying nature, which draws us towards awakening, kind of like a magnet. We're oriented towards awakening because we have that as our true underlying nature. And Shinjin is that, but Shinjin is, from our perspective, not our normal everyday mind. It's the mind of the Buddha. It's the mind of Amida Buddha. And so for us to give rise to it means that we receive it as you could call it as a gift or as something bestowed by Amida Buddha. That's how we understand it usually in Jōdo Shinshū. We'll get into it in much more detail um, in future sessions, of course. Great. Okay, well, yeah, so we've reached 90 minutes. So what we'll do now is a dedication of merits. And the dedication of merits here is a translation based on one of Shandao's liturgies, but it's versified. Okay, please join palms. May merits that to Bodhi are aligned be shared by all and constantly increase. May we all awaken the Bodhi mind and be born in Amida's land of peace. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing. Okay, thank you everyone. And yeah, hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week when we'll start with the larger sutra.